Chapter 7 of Tractate Bava Metzia continues going through the various laws of hiring and paying employees. The first Mishnah says, if somebody hires day workers, he's only allowed to have them arrive early and work until dark, if that's the working custom of the locale. Otherwise, he can't do this. Additionally, if the custom of the locale is for the employers to feed their workers, he must do that too, to whatever extent the custom goes towards. In fact, broadly, everything goes according to its local custom by these laws. There's an incident recorded where the sons of one sage went and hired laborers and told them they'd provide them with food, and the sage told the sons to clarify that they'd only be provided with some basic accommodations, as these hired workers were the descendants of the forefathers, who were noted for giving their guests particularly lavish feasts, so he didn't want to make himself responsible for all of that. Others disagreed and said simply it goes by the current locale as for what you're expected to feed your employees. The Gemara clarifies, an employer can't have his workers work for longer than the local custom, even if he paid them a higher wage. Some specifically held that a worker needs to only work late but is not expected to show up early, which is explained to refer to by a new town with immigrants with no established custom, or it's that the employer has told his workers they're being hired according to the scriptural conditions of employment. A few related verses are expounded on. There's a story. A sage was speaking to some officers who were struggling to catch local thieves, and he gave them advice to enter diners in the morning and see who's really tired, and then ask them what their profession is. And if they say something like a student or a particular job that requires them to work at night, then they're probably innocent. And if they say otherwise, they should be questioned as a thief. So, they thought this was such a good idea that they decided to hire the sage to start implementing this. Other sages criticized him, saying it wasn't his place to go around arresting other Jewish people, and such a decision should instead be left to God. But the sage said that what he was doing was good, as he was ridding the Jewish people of their evildoers. Once, a man insulted the sage, and he had the man arrested, and then later tried to have him freed, but he couldn't, and the man was executed by the government. But he later found out that the man was actually guilty of the sin of cohabiting along with his son with a betrothed young woman on Yom Kippur, but in spite of this, he still felt guilty. So he ended up having a surgery performed to see if he had done the wrong thing, where he had pieces of his stomach fat removed and placed in the sun, and it turns out that they didn't rot. Apparently, this also happened by some other individuals. It also describes some interesting related points and some of the attributes of some sages, including their impressive physical qualities, which are listed, particularly the noted attractiveness of the sage Rabbi Yochanan, which is compared to that of a silver goblet filled with pomegranate seeds. Uniquely, however, he didn't have a beard, which is mentioned. This is seen in the famous story wherein Rabbi Yochanan, when he was younger, was swimming in the Jordan River, when suddenly a man named Reish Lakish, who was a famous bandit leader, saw him and tried to attack him, as he thought Rabbi Yochanan was a woman. Anyways, after he realized Rabbi Yochanan was actually a man, they conversed, and Rabbi Yochanan recommended that instead he use his strength for Torah, and offered, if Reish Lakish were to repent from being a bandit chief, he could marry his sister, who was even more beautiful than him. Reish Lakish agreed, and they started learning together, and eventually Reish Lakish became a noted great sage who's frequently quoted throughout the Gemara. Anyways, many years later, they were debating the point as to when certain metal weapons start becoming susceptible to ritual impurity, and they began to argue. Rabbi Yochanan asked Reish Lakish about this, saying he used to be an expert on such weapons, and this upset Reish Lakish, thinking it was an insult, and he expressed this. But Rabbi Yochanan misunderstood him and thought he was expressing regret at changing his profession from being a thief. So Rabbi Yochanan became upset, and in turn, Reish Lakish became sick. Reish Lakish eventually passed away, and Rabbi Yochanan, in turn, was very upset. The other sages tried to give him a replacement student, but Rabbi Yochanan wouldn't have it, saying nobody compared to Reish Lakish, and he eventually became so sad that he lost his sanity, and the other sages prayed for him, and he passed away. Anyways, back to the original story with the sage who was appointed as an officer. He was still upset with himself, so he accepted physical suffering upon himself, and he became horribly ill, until eventually his wife told him to stop, and she had him healed. Anyways, then he went back to his studies, and he was extremely proficient in determining whether select blood samples were pure or not in regards to the laws of Nida. It brings other instances showing the greatness of the sage. Particularly, his body afterwards lay in an attic for many years, and it never decayed in his merit. It brings instances of similar things occurring to other sages and their referenced greatness. It also mentions the sage who had a son who really didn't want to become a sage himself, but eventually decided to and was very successful, as was his descendants. There are related teachings on this. It also mentions the greatness of other sages, particularly Rabbi Chia, about who it says would hand grow flax, weave nets, then trap deer, and feed the meat to orphans, and then prepare the deer hide into scrolls on which he wrote the Torah, and then went to villages and taught it to children, and also how to teach it to others to prevent the Torah from ever being forgotten. There are further points on his greatness. It said, after he passed, another sage looked at Rabbi Chia's heavenly throne and was blinded until he requested forgiveness. It's also said that Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, told one of the sages that he would awaken each of the forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, at different times, as if they all prayed simultaneously, Mashiach would come instantly. And also, he mentioned that Rabbi Chia and his sons were comparable to them. So this sage quickly went to have Rabbi Chia and his sons all pray together. And then as the part of prayer for wind was said, wind started blowing, and by the prayer for rain, it started to rain, and by the prayer to awaken the dead, the world started to shake. So Eliyahu the prophet, in the meanwhile, was reprimanded and made to interrupt the prayer service by appearing in the form of a fiery bear. The greatness of other sages are referenced. There was Rabba bar Nachmani, who was forced to flee the country after people started lying that he didn't pay his taxes. He made it all the way to the city of Pumbedisa, and while he was there, the officers that were sent to find him were attacked by demons and had their faces turned backwards, so he gave advice on how to cure them and then left before he was arrested. Eventually he was arrested and imprisoned and prayed to God, so the prison wall collapsed and he escaped. So he went to live in a swamp and studied Torah all day, until eventually the angel of death came to fetch him, but couldn't approach him as he was learning Torah, so the angel blew into a reed, and the sage thought it was the officers coming to arrest him, and he prayed to quickly pass away instead of being arrested, which he then did. It said that a note fell from God in the city, letting the sages know where his body was, so that way he could be buried, and he was then eulogized at length, which is described. Back to the original point, we said that employers need to feed their workers according to the local custom. This is said to mean that the workers can demand to be fed first before working, if that's what's done in the region. It's also said that the forefathers would give great feasts to their guests, which it then proceeds to describe at length based on some verses, particularly involving the time Abraham had 3 angels come over as guests, as described in the verses, although the angels only pretended to eat the food, it says. It's actually stated that God made the day extremely hot, so that way Abraham would stay indoors and not need to deal with guests, as he had just been freshly circumcised, but he insisted and in fact went and chased after the 3 men after they almost left, saying that he was preoccupied. These 3 men were actually 3 angels, as is stated, particularly the angel Nachael, sent to give the news to Sarah that she was to have a child, and also to save Lot from the city of Sodom. The angel Raphael was sent to heal Abraham, and the angel Gabriel was sent to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It further describes this meal and the surrounding events. It mentions that the verse states Sarah was in the tent, specifically in a different room, showing she was very modest, which was stated by the angel to draw attention to it. It also says that Sarah regains her youth when she was told that she would have children again. It's also said that after Yitzchak was born, everybody doubted that he was their actual child due to their advanced age, but this was disproven as they had a large party to celebrate, and Sarah was seen to be able to nurse, and the child looked just like Abraham, so it was clear they were his parents. It's also said that until this time, there were no physical signs of old age, until God decided it was necessary for people to be able to differentiate between Abraham and Yitzchak, who were identical. It's also said that there was no sickness before death until Yaakov, who prayed for that to be the case, so that he could know when he was going to pass. And also, before Elisha, no one ever recovered from an illness until Elisha prayed that it should be so. It qualifies the remaining points. New Mishnah. The following types of employees are biblically permitted to eat from their employer's food. Somebody whose job it is to harvest produce, and somebody who works with detached produce that grew from the ground before tithing becomes necessary. The following do not have the right to eat of the produce that they're working with. Somebody who works with produce that is still in the process of growing, somebody who works with detached produce after tithing is necessary, and somebody who works with produce that doesn't grow from the ground. The Gemara cites the scriptural sources for all of these points. There are related adjacent discussions. It said that produce only becomes subject to tithing once it enters the owner's house, specifically through the main entrance, which is qualified. It discusses this and some related principles of tithing produce and brings additional sources for the listed points in the Mishnah. This is discussed further. It also asks as to whether the worker is allowed to put the produce in a fire to cook it before eating it. It tries, but is unsuccessful in comparing it to a few different cases. There's an apparent argument as to whether the worker can put salt on the produce as he eats it. It's explained to be prohibited if this is done with 2 fruit, which establishes an obligation for tithing. There are related points on the prohibition against muzzling one's animal as it works and how this would uniquely apply to the laws of tithes. There are other discussed points. For instance, it's said that an animal shouldn't even be muzzled and then brought to thresh. There's a debate if there's liability for not physically muzzling an animal, but just for verbally reprimanding it whenever it tries to eat. It debates between these opinions. It said that the punishment for impermissibly muzzling somebody's animal while threshing is both lashes and a monetary payment to the owner. This is according to the opinion, apparently, that there could be punishment of lashes and payment at the same time, although there are a few suggested answers and a few unrelated points are then discussed. These are basically some prohibitions against mixing diverse species of animals in breeding. New Mishnah. The worker gets to eat of the produce he works with, as described, even if he's only working with his hands, feet, or shoulders. Others say he can only eat the produce if he works with his hands and feet specifically. The Gemara cites sources for this debate. Related, it said that workers in a wine press can only eat grapes until they've walked the full length and breadth of the wine press, after which point they can then also drink of the wine. New Mishnah. If a worker was working with figs, he can't eat any grapes, and if he was working with grapes, he can't eat any figs. A worker is allowed to not eat anything until he gets to a place with better fruits and then eat over there. The worker can only eat of this produce during the time of his actual work. However, to prevent the workers from retaining excess to eat as they walk, they're allowed to eat from vines as they walk between vineyards and on the way back from the wine press. And similarly, a donkey can eat as it unloads. The Gemara gets into a debate as to whether a worker working on a grapevine can then eat of a different grapevine belonging to the same owner. It argued this from a few discussions. It's largely left unresolved. The last point on the donkey was to say that a donkey can eat from the load that's on their own back, so long as the owner doesn't actually take it and feed it to them. New Mishnah. A worker can eat very expensive fruits he's working with, even something like a cucumber or a date worth a dinner, which is a very large sum. Some say they can't eat more than their wage, but others say they can, and they just shouldn't be gluttonous personally and thereby not get hired. The Gemara explains, there's actually a difference between opinions as to whether the worker is advised to do this. Others say there's a difference, that there's disagreement if, for instance, the employer hired the man to pick a single grape cluster if he can then eat it, which is discussed further. Others say it's a debate if these principles apply solely to workers or to everybody. It's also a debate if the worker's produce actually belong to him specifically or not, which is relevant if he wants to have the produce sent to his family. It argues this from a few sources. This is additionally debated at length from various different discussions, and it basically ends by saying it's just a debate between different opinions. New Mishnah. A person can stipulate for himself, his adult son or daughter, his adult slave, or for his wife, that they waive the rights to their produce in exchange for monetary reimbursement. This is as they have intelligence and the ability to make decisions, unlike minor children or slaves or animals. If somebody hires workers to harvest his neta revai produce, which is fruit produced in its fourth year that can only be eaten in Jerusalem unless this tithe is taken from it, the workers cannot eat of it. If he didn't tell them it was this specific neta revai produce before hiring them, he must redeem some produce and then give it to them. Similarly, if he hired workers to repair his fig cakes or wine casks, they can't eat of them because they need to be tithed. But if he didn't tell them in advance that they're not tithed, he needed to tithe them and then give some to the workers. Also, those who guard produce can partake of the fruits, although that's not a scripturally based principle. The Gemara says there's a debate by this last point as to if guardians of produce can partake of them, if this only applies in gardens and orchards, or according to others, only to wine presses and piles of unprocessed produce. It debates these points from various quoted sources and finds proofs for this latter opinion. New Mishnah. There are basically four types of guardians: an unpaid guardian, a borrower, a paid guardian, and a renter. If something happened to an animal that needed to be washed, the unpaid guardian needs to take oaths regarding everything, exempting himself from negligence and payment. The borrower needs to pay for everything. A paid guardian and a renter take oaths if the animal broke a limb, was captured, or died of natural causes, and they need to pay for it if it was lost or stolen. The Gemara quotes the source for this. There are a few relevant instances discussed on these laws, and it more particularly qualifies each of these specific positions' responsibilities. New Mishnah. Regarding responsibilities of a guardian, an attack by a wolf is not considered to be unavoidable, while an attack by two wolves is, in regards to whether or not he's then responsible to pay for it. Others say one wolf is still unavoidable if there's a plague of wolves. Two dogs is not considered to be unavoidable, although others say they are if they come from different directions. An attack by a bandit, a lion, a bear, a snake, and similar are considered to be unavoidable, unless the shepherd decided to go and lead the animals to their lair. Death by natural causes is considered unavoidable. If the guardian caused the death, it's not considered to be unavoidable. If it fell off of a mountain, that's unavoidable unless the guardian brought it there himself. The Gemara discusses these and qualifies a few of them. For instance, the bandit here is specifically when he's armed, and it says he'd even be able to beat an armed shepherd, as the bandit would be willing to risk his life, unlike the shepherd apparently. If the shepherd approaches a bandit and informs him of the information around his camp and the number of people and everything involving that, it's not considered to be unavoidable. New Mishnah. An unpaid guardian can stipulate to be exempt from an oath, a borrower can stipulate to be exempt from paying, and a paid guardian or renter can stipulate to be exempt from an oath or paying. Generally, if somebody makes a stipulation contrary to Torah law, it's void. Any stipulation where the man does the action before making the stipulation is void. If the stipulation is possible to fulfill and made initially, then it stands. The Gemara explains how listed stipulations work, and this is like the opinion that they're allowed if they involve monetary law. It debates this and actually suggests that the reason is as the guardians didn't even initially obligate themselves to have more responsibilities than was stipulated in these cases. It also quotes a source which seems to say a person can stipulate to increase his responsibility. We said that if a stipulation can't be fulfilled, it's void. Others nevertheless debate this, although it does rule like the former. And that's the end of chapter 7.